Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, I don't really care about the size of Taylor Swift's carbon footprint. Honestly, I also don't really care about Joe Biden's or John Kerry's or Leonardo DiCaprio's either. They're obviously hypocrites, but their emissions are also obviously a drop in the bucket of on a global scale of emissions. Now, as Congress negotiates climate legislation, a report from marketing agency Yard is making big waves for pegging Taylor Swift as the worst private jet CO2 emission offender among celebrities. Yard crunched the numbers based on the celebrity jet's Twitter account. According to their analysis, Swift's total flight emissions for the year come in at 8,293 tons, or 1,184 times more than the average person's total emissions. While we're on the topic, Swift's spokesperson all but confirmed the numbers in a hilarious defense of their boss, telling BuzzFeed, "Taylor's jet is loaned out regularly to other individuals. To attribute most or all of these trips to her is blatantly incorrect." I love this tweet. Take a look at it. You've really got to hand it to Taylor Swift's publicist, because she generously rents out her jet for her poorer friends who can't afford their own personal jets to use. Is the funniest possible way to put a humanitarian spin on her carbon emissions. That's what one viral tweet mocked Swift over. Now, Swift, by the way, cited climate change as one of the reasons she mourned when her interventions on behalf of Democrats to defeat Marsha Blackburn's Senate campaign failed several years back. So I'm in the Michael Schellenberger camp generally when it comes to the threat of climate change. I know a lot of you probably disagree with that. Schellenberger wrote, global emissions are still likely to peak within the next decade, and the result will be a much smaller increase in global average temperatures than almost anyone predicted just 5 years ago. A 3 degrees Celsius increase is hardly an existential threat to humanity. Of popular sea level predictions on the global rise, he added, even if these predictions prove to be significant underestimates, the slow pace of sea level rise will likely allow societies ample time for adaptation. So, surely in proper perspective, the threat of human-induced climate change does not hinge on celebrities' relentless use of private jets. So why not just ignore this entire media circus? Well, oddly enough, the audacity of our very sanctimonious celebrity class is but one element of a broader trend that's extremely relevant here. Elite climate alarmists demanding everyone else make sacrifices to their own convenience while refusing to do the same. So how are Democrats planning to fund their ambitious climate spending in the bill they're negotiating right now, which makes up the majority of that bill, which has a name about inflation reduction? Small tax increases across the board, which they claim will be offset by subsidies, and billions of dollars in spending that, according to a Wharton model, produce, quote, a very low level of confidence that the legislation will have any impact on inflation. That model predicts a small increase in inflation over the next few years, followed by a small decrease in the late 2020s, although, again, they are not, quote, statistically different than zero, as Wharton put it. We do not need to get into the weeds of climate prediction or statistical modeling, because we probably disagree on all of that, to see clearly one important point. Why do celebrities rely heavily on private jets? It's a matter of convenience. I would probably do the same thing if I were them. The problem isn't that they emit all kinds of carbon. The problem is that they refuse to sacrifice their own conveniences while breezily expecting the unwashed masses to subsidize their neighbor's electric vehicle while paying off a trusty Honda that takes them long distances without any worries. The bill plans to massively boost the size of the IRS with the stated goal of also boosting enforcement. As the Wall Street Journal noted, quote, the Joint Committee on Taxation, Congress's official tax scorekeeper, says that from 78% to 90% of the money raised from underreported income would likely come from those making less than $200,000 a year. Meanwhile, the Journal continues, the IRS knows the super wealthy employ lawyers and accountants who make litigation time-consuming and risky. Now, IRS allies obviously argue that's why the agency needs more money to afford enforcement on the wealthiest Americans who make it expensive to audit them. But that is simply not what the numbers show will happen. By all means, collect taxes from people who owe them, corporations, individuals, develop better technology, if only in the name of national security. But remember that, as one report found, 61% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Remember, their average savings are less than the price of one trip on private jets. Remember, both of those figures have gotten worse since last year as inflation itself worsened. I don't mind the concept of shared sacrifice, but this bill, like many others before it, is not engineered to share that sacrifice. It's engineered for the rich to pass the sacrifice disproportionately off on people whose communities and livelihoods they've already plundered in so many cases. We can debate the net benefit of the bill. We can debate climate prediction, but there's no confusion about who's being asked to sacrifice more and why. So, Katie, like I said, I don't think there's a reason necessarily to get in the weeds of debating climate predictions or the net impact of this bill. I do, though, think it's really telling that a Democratic-led bill negotiated by Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin that will likely be signed into law by President Biden pending what we hear from the parliamentarian, it does require sacrifices on behalf of the broader public, but you're never going to see John Kerry sacrifice using his private jet, no matter how much flack he takes for it, because he simply doesn't care. It's the convenience outweighs the cost of the public backlash, or from his perspective, the cost of the emissions.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think that, as we were talking about earlier, an interesting element of this is, George Bush did fire the parliamentarian.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Yeah, and so I just think that speaks to how, Democrats love to convince you that their hands are tied. They show up to a fight, though, with one hand, tied behind their back anyway, that they tied to, I don't know what you could tie a hand to.
Right.
Their belt or something.
Yeah.
But, I think that it is kind of laughable, these bills that present themselves as major accomplishments, because as we talked about, there's so many loopholes, because it really doesn't help the climate. I think that lends itself to people being able to focus on one person's jet. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you think that Taylor Swift's jet is bad, get a load of Elon Musk's rocket ship, right? There's always something you can heighten it with. But I think that the idea of shared sacrifice is one that is often weaponized, and there is a difference, as you were saying, between shared sacrifice that affects people of means differently than it does people without means. Mm-hmm. And so that's often just used as a cliche to justify unfair, unshared sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's what's upsetting. I mean, obviously, neither of us are under any illusions about either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Yeah. I think we all know that they're, backed by corporations and have been for years. But what is so annoying is when celebrities and politicians moralize to everyone else, but then don't have any moral credibility on their end. And again, we know that. That's why I don't care about the size of Taylor Swift's carbon footprint.
Sure.
We know it sucks. Right. We know she sucks. We get these things in terms of their politics.
You just shake it off?
Oh, Katie,
you don't care about it?
That was bad.
Sorry.
Just leave.
I don't even know enough of her songs to make any other puns, so you're in luck. It's not for lack of desire.
Man, the big difference between Ryan and Katie, Taylor Swift reference.
Yeah, I mean, he must know more of her songs than I do.
But again, these sacrifices are always easier for the wealthy to make, whether it's switching to an electric vehicle, because the person who has to drive, 300 miles on the weekends to take care of their mom in a rural area doesn't want to make that switch yet. They're still paying off their trusty Honda. What's much easier for the Kerry family to get into the electric vehicle space.
Right. I mean, I do still think that I'd rather people be hypocrites and still advocate for better policies than hypocrites and not advocate for better policies, if that makes sense.
But I feel like their hypocrisy makes it really hard for them to not have these class blind spots that would result in better policies.
Sure.
It's just all so disappointing.
I know. I'm going to jet out of here. Sorry.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
You should jet out of here right now.
Emily's not even pretending to tolerate me.
Oh, we will have more rising and more puns from Two-Straw Katie, as I call her, after this.
But they're paper, not plastic.
They're paper.
You're welcome, world. You're welcome, planet, Mother Nature.
More rising after this.